When The Conjuring terrified audiences in 2013, it claimed to tell the true story of the Perron family's haunting at the old Arnold estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island. For over a decade, paranormal enthusiasts treated the house as proof that demonic possession is real, that the Warrens documented genuine evil, and that Bathsheba Sherman cursed the property. Subscribe now, because after years of investigation, researchers finally uncovered what really happened. The truth isn't comforting. Bathsheba was innocent. The Warrens exploited a family in crisis, and what finally shut down the Conjuring House wasn't exorcism, it was building permits. This is what actually happened. The old Arnold estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island earned its haunted reputation long before the Perron family arrived in 1971, with local folklore painting the property as cursed, tragic, and perpetually associated with death spanning nearly 3 centuries. The farmhouse construction dates to 1736, making it almost 300 years old and positioning it among the oldest continuously standing structures in rural Rhode Island. From its earliest documented history, the property experienced deaths, though this represented entirely normal circumstances for 18th and 19th century agricultural properties, where families lived, worked, gave birth, and died within the same walls across multiple generations. Prudence Arnold, a young woman from the original family occupying the property during the 1700s, allegedly died under mysterious circumstances that local stories described as hanging in the barn, though whether this represented suicide, accidental death, or something more sinister was never conclusively established through available historical records. The story persisted through oral tradition, growing more dramatic with each retelling across generations of Harrisville residents. During the 1800s, several children from families living at the property died young, adding additional tragic deaths to the location's history. However, childhood mortality during this era reached tragically high levels across all of New England due to infectious diseases, lack of modern medicine, dangerous farm equipment, and harsh living conditions that made child deaths heartbreakingly common rather than unusual. Each death nonetheless contributed to the property's developing reputation as a place where tragedy seemed to linger, where families struggled, where misfortune accumulated. By the early 1900s, neighbors reportedly avoided the property not necessarily because of documented supernatural activity, but because it had acquired that quality old rural farmhouses sometimes develop. A feeling of being forgotten by time, perpetually associated with sadness, isolated from normal community life, carrying the weight of too many stories. When Roger and Carolyn Perron purchased the property in December 1971 with their 5 daughters, they were moving into a house that already carried substantial folklore, a house locals whispered warnings about, a house where tragedy was almost expected based on centuries of accumulated reputation. The crucial question researchers would later ask, were these stories based on genuinely unusual patterns of death and misfortune, or simply the normal accumulation of tragedy that any 300-year-old property would naturally experience, amplified through generations of storytelling until normal became supernatural? The most famous figure associated with the Conjuring House haunting is Bathsheba Sherman, portrayed in the film as a demonic entity, a satanic witch who murdered children, sacrificed her own infant to Satan, cursed the property, and possessed Carolyn Perron in scenes of terrifying supernatural evil. The movie depicts her as pure malevolence, a woman who sold her soul, proclaimed she would haunt anyone daring to live on her land, and represented everything dark about New England witch folklore. However, the real Bathsheba Sherman tells a completely different story that bears almost no resemblance to the monster created by legend and Hollywood dramatization. She was born Bathsheba Thayer in 1812 in Rhode Island to a typical farming family of the era. She married Judson Sherman in 1844, and they established life on a farm adjacent to what would eventually become known as the Conjuring House. They had multiple children across their marriage, with some dying in infancy, as tragically occurred in the majority of 19th century families before modern medicine reduced infant mortality. In 1849, an incident occurred that would define Bathsheba's reputation for the next century and a half. An infant died while in her care, a child belonging to a family for whom Bathsheba worked as a nursemaid, providing childcare to supplement the family's farming income. An inquest was held following the infant's death, as was standard procedure for any unexplained child death during this era. Bathsheba was questioned by local authorities investigating the circumstances. Here is the crucial detail that subsequent legend completely ignored. She was cleared. The death was officially ruled natural causes, most likely illness or a congenital condition that 19th century medicine couldn't treat or even properly diagnose. Bathsheba was not charged with any crime. She was investigated and formally exonerated through the legal process available at that time. That single incident, one investigated infant death with official exoneration, became the foundation for everything that followed. By the time the Perron family moved into the adjacent property 120 years later, local legend had transformed that one cleared investigation into something exponentially darker. Bathsheba had become, through generations of gossip and embellishment, a serial child killer who murdered multiple infants, a practicing witch who engaged in satanic rituals, a woman who sacrificed her own baby to demonic forces. But researchers examining historical records from the 1800s found absolutely no evidence supporting any of these claims. In December 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perron purchased the old Arnold estate with their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, seeking affordable property in rural Rhode Island that could accommodate their large family. Roger worked as a truck driver following his military service, while Carolyn managed the household and children. The house was in rough condition, run down and drafty, desperately needing extensive repairs they couldn't afford, but it was large enough for 7 people and priced within their limited budget. Previous owners had left quickly and sold below market value, a detail that should have raised questions but instead seemed like good fortune to a family stretching financially. According to family accounts documented in Andrea Perron's later books about the experience, strange phenomena began occurring from the very first night they moved in, though the early experiences were subtle rather than dramatic horror movie events. Objects would appear in different locations than where family members remembered placing them. Small piles of dirt would mysteriously appear on floors Carolyn had just swept clean. Brooms would fall over when nobody was near them. Doors would swing open despite being closed moments earlier. The family dog would bark intensely at empty corners and refuse to enter certain rooms no matter how much family members encouraged or commanded. One daughter described smelling wonderful perfume with no identifiable source. Another felt tucked into bed at night by invisible caring hands that seemed protective rather than threatening. Some early spirits the family began identifying seemed benign or even welcoming, like the presence they called Manny, who appeared gentle. The haunting during those initial weeks was not terrifying to the family. It was almost comforting, suggesting the house was inhabited by spirits but not hostile ones. The family gradually began thinking of their home as different from normal houses, as a place where unusual things happened, but where they could coexist with whatever presences shared their space. This gentle beginning becomes critically important when analyzing what happened later. The family was not immediately terrified or traumatized. They gradually accepted that their house was haunted, that supernatural activity was occurring around them. They normalized the phenomena. Once you accept your house is genuinely haunted, once you begin interpreting everyday oddities through that supernatural lens, your entire perception shifts fundamentally. Everything becomes evidence rather than coincidence. Every creak in old floorboards, every shadow from passing headlights, every misplaced object is no longer random or explainable. It becomes intentional, purposeful, proof you are not alone, confirmation that spirits are interacting with your family. The transformation from gentle oddities to hostile phenomena happened gradually across the first year of the Perron family's residence, and according to family accounts, it was as if the house was initially testing them, observing their reactions. Then once it understood they were not leaving, the activity became aggressive and frightening. Temperatures in certain rooms would drop dramatically without explanation, creating cold spots that felt unnatural even in winter. Family members reported feeling constantly watched, that invisible eyes followed them through rooms and hallways. Carolyn began reporting being touched by invisible hands, but not gently like the protective tucking in her daughters had experienced. These were aggressive touches that felt threatening and violated her personal space. She started finding mysterious bruises appearing on her body, large dark bruises on her legs, arms, and torso that she couldn't explain through any normal activity. She insisted she had not bumped into furniture or fallen or injured herself through any identifiable accident. The bruises would simply appear overnight, dark and painful, as if something had grabbed her or struck her with considerable force. The daughters started seeing full apparitions, complete figures of people who should not be present in the house. Shadow figures moved through hallways when nobody was walking there. Faces appeared in windows looking in from outside. Shapes stood beside beds at night watching the sleeping children. However, analyzing these experiences from a research perspective becomes extremely difficult because the phenomena were almost entirely subjective, happening to individual family members, often at night, frequently when they were alone or half asleep or in states between waking and sleeping where perception becomes unreliable. There was no objective documentation of any of these experiences, no photographs capturing apparitions, No audio recordings preserving mysterious sounds, no video evidence, no measurements by scientific instruments, just testimony from people who were increasingly frightened and primed to interpret experiences as supernatural. Does the lack of objective evidence mean they were lying about their experiences? Absolutely not. There's no reason to believe the Perron family fabricated their story for attention or profit. Does it mean they were mistaken or misinterpreting normal phenomena? Not necessarily. Subjective experience can be genuine without having supernatural causes, but it means understanding what really happened requires considering multiple possible explanations beyond just accepting supernatural causes as the only interpretation. Researchers examining the case decades later noted several important factors that the family was experiencing simultaneously. One of the most chilling and frequently repeated elements of the Conjuring House legend originated with young Cindy Perron, who at some point during the family's residence claimed that voices in the house had told her something specific and terrifying. 7 dead soldiers were buried inside the walls of the structure. This claim became one of the most famous aspects of the haunting narrative, suggesting that Civil War-era soldiers had been murdered on the property and their bodies concealed within the house structure itself, creating a horrifying explanation for the supernatural activity the family was experiencing. The Warrens referenced this detail during their investigation. The movie incorporated elements of this soldier story into its narrative. Ghost hunters who later visited the property specifically searched for evidence of these buried soldiers, looking for anomalies in walls that might indicate concealed remains. Paranormal investigators brought equipment attempting to detect bodies within the structure. The story became accepted fact within the paranormal community discussing the Conjuring House. However, here is the significant problem that researchers later identified. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that 7 soldiers or any soldiers were ever buried in the walls. No bodies were ever discovered despite multiple searches. No historical records suggest soldiers died at the property or went missing in the area during any military conflict. No excavation or wall examination revealed human remains. No forensic analysis detected decomposition evidence. The story existed entirely as an unverified claim from a frightened child who said she heard voices telling her this information. So where did this story actually originate? A young girl living in a house she believed was haunted said she heard voices communicating this specific claim. Her family, already completely primed to believe the house was genuinely haunted and that supernatural entities were present, accepted her statement as true without seeking verification. The story was repeated to neighbors, investigators, and eventually the Warrens. It was amplified through each retelling, becoming more concrete and detailed. Eventually, through sheer repetition across multiple sources, it became accepted as established fact rather than unverified testimony. Researchers studying how folklore develops noted this represents a textbook example of how legends form and solidify. An initial claim, regardless of verification status, gets repeated by trusted sources. Each repetition adds legitimacy simply through familiarity. Eventually, the claim becomes so widely accepted that questioning it seems absurd. Everyone knows 7 soldiers are buried in the walls, so it must be true. But trace the story back to its origin and you find a frightened child, no evidence, and a claim that was never verified but became truth through repetition. As the alleged haunting progressed through the mid-1970s, the phenomena became increasingly focused on Carolyn Perron specifically, rather than distributed equally among all family members. She was finding the most bruises on her body. She was experiencing the most aggressive phenomena. She was becoming progressively more exhausted, fearful, and convinced something was targeting her personally with deliberate intent to harm. The family believed this targeting occurred because she was the mother, that the entity they identified as Bathsheba Sherman was jealous of Carolyn's role and attempting to possess her to take her place. However, researchers examining the case later identified other possible explanations that have nothing to do with supernatural possession. Carolyn was under enormous stress from multiple sources simultaneously. She had 5 daughters to care for in a deteriorating house with constant maintenance problems and limited money for repairs. Her husband was frequently away for extended periods due to his truck driving work, leaving her alone with full responsibility for children and household. Money was extremely tight, creating constant financial stress about meeting basic needs. The rural isolation meant she had limited social support systems, few friends nearby, minimal adult interaction during long days. She was also extremely frightened by the idea the house was haunted, genuinely terrified by phenomena she believed was occurring around her, but the family could not afford to move to different housing. This combination of factors Financial stress, exhaustion, isolation, sole responsibility for 5 children, fear, and constant hypervigilance watching for supernatural activity creates conditions perfectly suited for psychological and physical breakdown. The human body responds to chronic stress in measurable physiological ways. Sustained high levels of cortisol and adrenaline affect immune system function, pain perception, sleep quality, and overall health. People under extreme prolonged stress can develop very real physical symptoms that have psychological rather than physical causes, a phenomenon well documented in medical literature. The bruises Carolyn found appearing on her body are frequently cited as definitive proof of supernatural attack, physical evidence that something was grabbing and striking her. However, bruises can result from many causes beyond supernatural violence. In a dark, cluttered old house where you are constantly anxious and exhausted, it becomes very easy to bump into furniture, door frames, and objects without consciously registering the impact at the time. Chronic stress affects blood vessel integrity, making bruising occur more easily from minor impacts. And in cases of extreme psychological distress, people can unconsciously harm themselves during sleep through movements and behaviors they have no waking memory of performing. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at the Perron house in the mid-1970s as established paranormal investigators claiming to have dealt with hundreds of cases involving possession and demonic haunting. They had already gained fame through investigating the Amityville Horror and numerous other high-profile cases that built their reputation as demonologists who could identify and combat supernatural evil. They investigated the Perron property, confirmed the house was under demonic influence according to their assessment, and decided that conducting a seance might allow communication with the spirits and potentially free Carolyn from the possession they believed was occurring. According to family accounts, during the seance, Carolyn became violent, speaking in voices that didn't sound like her normal speech patterns, demonstrating knowledge she supposedly shouldn't possess, and physically attacking people present in the room. Ed Warren had to physically restrain her while Lorraine attempted to communicate with the supposed demonic entity controlling Carolyn's body. The event became so traumatic that the family asked the Warrens to stop the ritual immediately. The Warrens advised afterward that the house could not be successfully cleansed of the demonic presence and that the family should move out as soon as possible for their safety. For believers in the paranormal, this seance represents definitive proof that the haunting was real and demonic in nature, that genuine possession was occurring, and that the Warrens heroically attempted to help despite enormous supernatural danger. However, recent investigation has raised extremely troubling questions about the Warrens' involvement and their methods. Ed and Lorraine Warren, despite their fame and self-proclaimed expertise, were not trained psychologists, licensed therapists, medical doctors, or credentialed mental health professionals of any kind. They were self-proclaimed demonologists whose qualifications were based entirely on their own assertions about their experiences and abilities rather than formal education or professional licensing. Performing a seance on a woman experiencing severe psychological distress without any medical oversight or professional mental health supervision was extraordinarily dangerous, regardless of whether demons actually exist. If someone is experiencing a psychological crisis, certain interventions can make the situation dramatically worse rather than better. Being told by authority figures that you are possessed by a demon can trigger dissociative episodes in vulnerable individuals. Being made the focus of a ritual specifically designed to draw out the demon creates enormous psychological pressure to behave in ways that match cultural expectations of what possession looks like. Mental health professionals who have examined detailed accounts of what happened to Carolyn during the seance note that her behavior matches trauma-induced dissociation and acute stress reactions far more closely than it matches verified cases of supernatural possession. After the Perron family finally left the property in 1980 following 9 years of escalating fear and psychological trauma, the house had several subsequent owners, and most of them lived there for extended periods without reporting anything remotely unusual. No supernatural phenomena, no attacks, no apparitions, no demonic presence. The house functioned as just an old farmhouse with normal old house problems like any 300-year-old structure would have. Then in 2013, The Conjuring was released to enormous commercial success. Everything changed overnight for the property. Suddenly, the old Arnold estate was known worldwide as the Conjuring House. Horror fans descended wanting to visit the famous location. Ghost hunters requested access to investigate. Paranormal enthusiasts treated it as a pilgrimage site proving supernatural evil exists. The owners at the time were completely overwhelmed by strangers appearing at all hours, trespassing on the property, requesting tours and overnight stays. In 2019, New owners Corey and Jennifer Heinzen took a dramatically different approach to the attention. They purchased the house specifically because of its paranormal reputation, not despite it. They embraced the fame completely. They launched the Conjuring House as a commercial business operation, offering ghost tours, overnight paranormal investigations, and special events where visitors paid hundreds of dollars to spend the night in the allegedly haunted location. Paranormal television shows filmed episodes there. The Heinzens promoted the property aggressively through social media and paranormal community networks. The house that had been the site of one family's private trauma became a profitable horror attraction, generating substantial revenue. However, this commercial transformation created serious problems that had nothing to do with ghosts. In 2022, the town of Burrillville issued a stop work order because the Heinzens had been making property modifications and operating a commercial business without obtaining required building permits. Code enforcement discovered building violations, missing permits for structural changes, and unauthorized commercial use of property zoned residential. Insurance companies identified that running a business in an allegedly dangerous haunted house created massive liability exposure. What happens if someone gets hurt during an overnight investigation, or experiences a psychological crisis, or claims they were attacked by supernatural forces? Insurance policies don't cover demonic possession or supernatural attacks, meaning the owners faced potentially devastating lawsuits with no insurance protection whatsoever. Licensing became another major problem because the property is zoned residential, not commercial, and operating a tourist attraction requires special commercial permits that had never been obtained.